The Jewish people has just come through a very difficult period of the year, Bein HaMetzarim, the 3 weeks of mourning between the fast of the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, the most difficult and tragic day on our calendar, on which both temples were destroyed. The exile from Spain happened in 1492 and the beginning of World War I. And during those 3 weeks, we read on each Shabbat a haftarah, a selection from the prophets that is one of Puranut, one that speaks about doom that's about to come, about destruction. And then our sages tell us that as we come to this week, Parshat Vaetchanan, we begin to read 7 haftarot of comfort, most from the book of Yeshayahu, the prophet, who came to comfort the Jewish people. Yes, there would be times of destruction, times of tragedy, but there would be times of consolation and comfort, looking forward to a future that is brighter. And that's what kept the Jewish people alive during all of these difficult times. Of course, in our generation, in our modern times, the most tragic event was the Holocaust. And the following story happens just a few years after the Holocaust in the land of Israel. There was, and in fact there is, a kibbutz called Haron, and this kibbutz was an extremely left-wing, anti-religious kibbutz. There was no religion allowed. There was no kashrut, there was no Shabbat, and there certainly wasn't a Beit HaKnesset. And one of the rules in this kibbutz, Ein Harod, was that no one was allowed to bring in a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll. It just simply was not allowed. They were creating a new type of Jew, and that Jew of the shtetl was something that was old-fashioned, antiquated, and anachronistic. But there was on that kibbutz a family, and their father had been through the Holocaust. He had been through Auschwitz. And he had taken with him throughout that hell a little Sefer Torah. He had kept it close to him. How he had managed to do that for so many years, in view of the Nazis, is difficult to understand, because they would confiscate any religious item and usually kill the person that had it. But he was able to smuggle that Sefer Torah throughout Auschwitz. And he came to Israel after the Holocaust, and he went to kibbutz Ein Harod, and he lived there with his family. And members of the kibbutz found out about the Sefer Torah. They stormed his room one day. They went looking for it. They took the Sefer Torah. They ran to the fence of the kibbutz, and they threw it over the fence into the mud. This story made all of the headlines in Israel in the time. It was a complete and utter shock. How could it be that Jews could take a Sefer Torah that had survived the hells of Auschwitz and throw it into the mud? How was it possible? The religious leaders at the time, the rabbis, proclaimed a fast day for the lack of respect for the bizayon, for the disgrace of the Torah. Everyone was weeping, everyone was completely shocked. But there was one rabbi who saw something positive in it. And this was Rav Yosef Kahaneman, known as the Ponevezher Rav. Rav Kahaneman was a great Talmudic sage who founded the Ponevezher Yeshiva in Lithuania. He lost all of his family in the Holocaust. But he came to Israel, and he had ideas of rebuilding, and he was going to build. And he came to Bnei Brak, and then it was just a small little hill. And he had a vision of a yeshiva. He was going to rebuild the Ponevezher Yeshiva, and so he did. And he, for the rest of his life, dedicated himself to rebuilding. Rabbi Kahaneman was a person of incredible vision. And he said, yes, he realizes how tragic this story was, but he sees in this tragedy a silver lining. And that is as follows. He said, if the Torah meant nothing to these people, if it was just an old manuscript, an old book, something from the Far East perhaps, they wouldn't have cared. So what, the old man has got it in his room. It's not going to make a difference. But the fact that they felt they had to go into his room and take it and throw it out means that they realized that the Torah has power, that it has something to it, that it must be authentic, and that as long as it's in the kibbutz, maybe it'll have this impact upon them, and they didn't want it to have this impact upon them. So they threw it over the fence. If it was just a meaningless book, they wouldn't have done anything. They would have just left it there. So he says, there we see that as tragic as the story was, it showed us that the Sefer Torah still meant something to them. And here Rav Kahaneman was not unlike the famous Talmudic scholar Rebbe Akiva. Rebbe Akiva, who lived through the destruction of the Second Temple, was once walking with some of his colleagues. and they were overlooking the site of where the temple had been. And there they looked down in the area where the Holy of Holies had stood, and there were foxes walking around. A fox came out, and they began to weep, tear their garments, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. And they said to him, Akiva, how can you laugh? How can you laugh when you see foxes walking around in an area that the only time in the entire year that anyone could go in there was Yom Kippur, and that was the Kohen Gadol? How can you laugh? And he said, I'll tell you why. Because there was a prophecy by the prophet Jeremiah, and he said that a time will come that the temple will be destroyed, and animals and foxes will walk around the holy places. He says, well, he's seen that that prophecy came true. And if that prophecy came true, then the other prophecies of the prophets will come true. That once again there will be a rebuilding. And therefore, out of the tragedy, he realized that if Hashem made good on his promise of destruction, he will certainly make good on his promise of rebuilding. And that was where Rav Kahneman drew his strength from. I recently did some follow-up, and I discovered that this kibbutz, Ein Harod, which is still there and is still a secular kibbutz, has nevertheless produced some Torah scholars, people who left the kibbutz and went out to study Torah. And would you believe it, that one of their former members has become a rabbi and goes back every single week to lecture at the kibbutz about Talmud, about Judaism. This is a wonder of our days. So yes, it's true that these tragedies happen, but we also see the nechama, we also see the incredible comfort that is offered to us by Hashem. Please God in the rebuilding, and please God in the coming soon of Mashiach speedily in our days. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.